Let's just say all of that is incredibly relevant to this time and any other. And his partner in crime, Tamler Sommers, is a professor of philosophy at the University of Houston. And he focuses primarily on ethics and political philosophy and the philosophy of law. And he specializes in topics like free will and moral responsibility, punishment, revenge, honor. Again, fascinating and all too relevant. In this podcast, we essentially took questions from Twitter. People had heard us on the Very Bad Wizards podcast and had topics they wanted us to address. We talk about free speech on campus. We do a fairly long post-mortem on my podcast with Scott Adams. So if you haven't heard that, you might listen to that first. Otherwise, feel free to skip ahead, especially if you're sick to death of hearing me talk about Trump. We talk about moral persuasion, and then we get into things like meditation and the sense in which the self may or may not be an illusion. Again, I encourage you to subscribe to their podcast because they are quite good. And now I bring you the Very Bad Wizards. I am here with the Very Bad Wizards, David, Tamler. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Sam.
I will have introduced you, and people may have heard our previous interviews on your show, but remind everyone where you are and what you guys tend to focus on when you're not causing trouble on your podcast.
Well, I am a professor of philosophy at the University of Houston.
You are Tamler.
And I am Tamler Sommers, right. And when I'm not podcasting on Very Bad Wizards with David, I am working on this book, which I've been working on for quite a while, for the last few years, that's coming out in the early spring, called In Defense of Honor. And it's about honor and morality.
Yeah, you like honor, right? That's something we could talk about. We can add that to the list of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look forward to that.
And I'm David Pizarro from Cornell University. When I'm not podcasting with Tamler and losing my cool on occasion, I do research on moral judgment and especially on the effects of emotion on judgment. So the emotion of disgust is something that maybe for the last 10 years I've been researching and how that can influence judgment, political judgment and moral and social judgment. And then just trying to teach the young minds, trying to sucker them into getting PhDs.
Our listeners want us to talk about the moral panic on campuses as one of the items. We went out on Twitter asking for topics, and I know you guys disagree with some people who think that it's a huge problem, and so I want to get into that because you guys are also on the front lines as professors. But first, let's just start with your podcast. Your podcast is fantastic. I'm a huge fan, and I'm a fan even though it seems every other time I tune in, you've said something disparaging about me.
That's Tamler trolling you. I wipe my hands clean of this one.
I think early on I was disparaging of certain remarks from your book, The Moral Landscape, on moral relativism. Since then, I think we've been very even-handed and balanced. And we don't even say anything about...
You would think that.
I believe Tamler's watching a different movie.
It's an emotional truth, what I just said.
Right.
It's not a fact-based truth, maybe, but...
Persuasive to somebody, nonetheless. Your podcast is great, and people should check it out, and we will provide a link or all the relevant links on my blog. But I'm just wondering, so your podcast, you're both professors full-time, and you have a fairly edgy podcast. I mean, you guys, you get into topics and you express opinions that I would think could conceivably get you in trouble. And this does actually connect with this first topic that has been suggested to us, this idea of a fundamental and spreading intolerance to free speech that's taking hold at the universities. Do you guys ever worry about what you're doing on the podcast with respect to your jobs? I mean, do you both have tenure? I mean, how do you think about your life at this point?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying I think that at first it was what some people refer to use an analogy, if I may, referred to as security through obscurity. I was sort of convinced at first that nobody would be listening, and therefore it would be perfectly okay. But I've been actually quite surprised. So as our listenership has grown, thanks to the many wonderful guests, including Sam, and as our audience has grown, I do not think, and Tamler, you can correct me, I think one of the things that is so nice about the long form podcast sort of discussion format is that that people can hear, they get to know you in a way that the things that you say are in a context of conversations, and for lack of a better word, I think they get to know your character a little bit, and some of the crazy things we say, people really are good at taking in context. And I don't
Twitter account
maybe one or two
that's
emails
specifically devoted to taking us out of context.
That's right. I believe one time I expressed the fear that we'd be taken out of context, and that Twitter account started up. And I don't know, I think maybe one or two times we've had somebody email us with maybe some anger about what we've said. But
You mean from your own institutions?
No.
From our listenership, from our own institutions, I genuinely think. I mean, part of it is I haven't made it sort of anything that I talk about too much in my own institution, in part because of that worry.
Honestly, to connect it to the topic, this is one of my points of evidence when I say that I think people exaggerate the degree to which there's a chilling effect, or that people can't express their views if they don't toe the line with, the progressive agenda or whatever. It's, I think neither of us do that. I think, maybe me even less than Dave. And I haven't heard not a single complaint from any colleague who listens to it, from any person at my institution who listens to it. And there are a bunch. Nobody has taken umbrage by a single thing that we've said. And we've said some repugnant shit, as that's part of our trademark. And I think it's for the reason that Dave says is, people get to know us and they know, I think, that our hearts are in the right place. And so as long as they know that, they're going to allow you to be a little edgier or more inappropriate and not try to shut you down. And so this is one of the things that makes me think that these incidents are it's not as widespread a phenomenon as it's portrayed by some in the media.
But there's a relevant part there that we didn't answer, which is we both have tenure. But I think we got tenure after maybe a year of doing the podcast. When we started, I don't think we had tenure, but we do have tenure, just to add that.
Right. Okay. Are you guys as irreverent or edgy in the classroom, or is there a very big difference between your podcast persona and your professor hat?
I teach a course, Intro Psychology, which is largely freshmen, with about 800 students enrolled. For many of them, it's their first experience in a lecture course in college. And while I probably tone it down, I don't purposefully. I mean, part of it is your persona kind of changes depending on the situation. So we it's more like we raise it up a notch on the podcast sometimes, but largely I say crazy things in my class all the time, and I've had students who take delight in writing it down. There was once somebody on Facebook who would quote me extensively. Why I got a Word document at the end of one semester from a student with a list of all the crazy things I had said. But usually, again, I think not on the first day. Sort of you build yourself up, and always I think, at least I try in an attempt to communicate something well. So if I drop an F-bomb, it's usually because I want somebody to remember something. I'll give an example. When I talk about evolutionary psychology, for instance, I remind students that if a claim is made that natural selection caused something, it has to be directly tied to the mechanism of survival and reproduction, or else it doesn't work through natural selection. So I just remind people, unless it leads to more fucking, it's not an evolutionary argument, like adaptiveness.
Clearly,
and I say that in an attempt at
function.
Yes.
Well, it's an attempt to much to the chagrin of my mother. It's an attempt to solidify a principle. Maybe I'm just making
This sounds a little post hoc to me.
You just want the laugh. You got
yeah.
800
Part of it is
18-year-olds
stand-up.
in front of you. It's your one moment of stand-up for the day. And Tamler, do you tone it down? Because
I'm not drunk usually when I teach, so that's one difference. But and every once in a while for the podcast, we
you
put
do
down a
drunk
few.
podcast?
Probably me again a little more frequently.
I've done that once.
Plus some other things, which I won't divulge. But anyway, so I think it's exactly what Dave said. You build up a little trust over the course of the semester, and they sort of get you and your, like I'm somebody that likes to go up and approach the line. I get bored when everybody is talking and it's a little too, everyone's being too polite or dancing around certain topics. And I think that students like that, and especially now when I think a lot of these students, at least at my institution, which is a public institution, and they're working jobs, and they're stressed out taking 5 classes, and a lot of them have family issues that they're dealing with and anxiety issues that they're dealing with. It is nice to just have a place where people can, not watch what they say and not feel like they have to walk on eggshells. So that's at least the kind of environment that I try to build. And again, in classes, I have yet to find that to be a problem, even remotely, like not one single complaint, at least one that has reached me.
Now we have to reconcile our worldviews because, and you know many of these principal experts, really. How do I square what you guys have just said with what Jonathan Haidt is saying and really canonizing in the heterodox academy, worrying about this creeping moral panic that is fundamentally antithetical to the core values of a university? I'm sure
Yeah.
David knows Jonathan, but perhaps you do too, Tamler. You guys really should have him on your podcast to talk about these things because I'd like to hear what he would say. But he's really worried about this. And then you have the cases of like Nicholas Christakis, who I'm sure at least David knows, Yale. You have Brett Weinstein, who at Evergreen University, which has gotten a lot of attention, and that just went fully off the rails. As far as I know, I'm not even sure his family is back in town yet, based on safety concerns. And then you have the Rebecca Tuval incident, and I actually had lunch with her to talk about her experience not that long ago. So it's totally possible that you guys are right and that these are individual cases that suggest very little about the rest of what's going on campuses. But take the first part. How do you think about how Haidt is describing this?
It's a tough question because I think this is one of those cases where two things can be true.
And one other thing, Tamler, I should say that you see, your stepmom is Christina Hoff Sommers, who is just this. Basically, as far as I can tell, she has a cult following on the right, or center right, for the way she's brought attention to this sort of issue.
Yes, especially as it relates to gender and yeah, and so yes, this is a debate I have often, and certainly every Thanksgiving. I'm pretty close to my stepmother, so we go back and forth. It's funny, like if you listen to us talk about it, I think we can both concede a little bit of, and this is how I feel about Haidt too. I thought The Coddling of the American Mind was, one of those first sort of overhyped pieces that captured the attention and the imagination of everybody. And I think people aren't good at looking at a video like the Christakis video or the Evergreen State video and they're bad cases. They're really bad. I mean, there's no denying it. If that was going on in or the Charles Murray thing, right? If that was going on in the universities, then people would be right that to panic about this. But what's, I think, difficult for people to process is day in and day out, how many things happen at the thousands and thousands of universities across the country where There's no stifling of speech. There's no chilling. There's none of that. Charles Murray successfully gave that same talk at 100 universities probably before Middlebury. And, Evergreen State is a little bit of a whack job liberal arts college to begin with, and for a while, this isn't true anymore, but for a while, anytime there was an article written about this, it was Oberlin. Like something happened in Oberlin, because that's just what Oberlin is. It's been like that for 50 years, and it'll probably be like that for another 50 years. So I think it's important to separate what's wrong, what's legitimately wrong that's going on at these particular institutions for what is going on in quote unquote the American university, because I think those two things are different. But I understand like Haidt will could concede some of that and say it is at these more privileged private institutions that this is occurring, but that's still a significant worry. And I have some sympathy with that.
Yeah, and just to make clear, I think that Tamler and I disagree about this often. Although we share a lot of the sentiment, I think that it's important to separate arguments about frequency with arguments about importance. And I do think that there is a probably measurable chilling effect in that that some professors are less willing to say some of the things that they used to say, or they think twice about it. And I do think there's probably a measurable difference in the average undergrad in the way that they think about a lot of these things. And then we can separate whether the reaction of panic, which I think Tamler is responding to, is the right sort of reaction to the problem as it currently stands, which I agree is probably not. It does get overblown and it captures attention. But I nonetheless do worry about it, and I do think that that we are creating an environment in which people pause before they say some things. But I always try to emphasize that there's a way in which a lot of this is actually progress. I do want people to pause before they say some things. And so if that's what's called chilling, then good. I think I mentioned this on one of our podcasts. I don't know if it made the final edit, but I did have a professor once tell me that he really felt like he couldn't tell the same jokes that he used to. And I said, like, what kind of jokes? And then he gave me an example, and it was a pretty racist joke. And I was like, good. In his defense, he wasn't from the U.S. and he didn't think it was a racist joke.
Right.
But it hasn't stopped Dave from his constant stream of anti-Semitism. So
I feel like that's the canary in the coal mine. The minute that gets squashed, I will announce to the world.
Right.
First, they came for the anti-Semites.
That's right.
I did nothing.
I just want to add that I think sometimes, I think Dave's right that sometimes professors feel like they have to watch what they say, but sometimes that's their fault, not the environment's fault. Like they've been reading too much of The Atlantic and too much, whatever, the latest column on the Heterodox blog, and now they've convinced themselves that they can't say anything that might border on inappropriate. Sometimes you just have to man up and just say the thing that you want to say. And if there's any blowback from that, then you'll deal with it,
Or woman up.
Or woman
Tamler.
up. Yes.
Or woman.
Sorry. Oh, God.
Or woman up.
Can you cut that? I'm going to get in big trouble.
I can't
for
believe
that.
you.
That's a keeper.
So, no, so I do think I was having this talk with a professor at a conference, and he said, I was in this faculty meeting, and then, an hour later, this faculty member tweeted out something. She didn't use my name, but something that I had said in the faculty meeting. And I was like, so who cares? So what? So maybe she'll tweet out something that you said at a faculty meeting. That doesn't mean you shouldn't say it. That's just life. It's life that when you say something, sometimes people will react in a certain way, and you deal with it then.
Yeah, the problem is that we have these cases which certainly on your account, are outlier cases where this stuff just goes completely haywire, and you have someone's career destroyed or there's at least just a massive public shaming
Right.
experience that follows in precisely that pattern. If you a tweet sent from a otherwise private meeting, or what was that incident where the guy wore a shirt to a conference and he was just vilified endlessly for the insensitivity of his shirt? Again, we have these cases that get media attention and at minimum advertise how haywire this can go. So it's easy to see how this would propagate back and cause everyone to choose their words more carefully.
I guess it's easy, but it's not an excuse. It's not a full excuse, you know? Professors generally are smart enough to understand the difference between a widespread phenomenon and some cases that still, I think, can reasonably be called isolated. And, like anything, like a terrorist attack, you don't want to overreact to it. You don't want to completely take away everybody's freedoms just because there was this one terrorist attack in Orlando. So, that's
I will say that I think it's important to say that in the many of the incidents that we've described, these people were treated horribly and unfairly, and there's no lack of assholes who are causing people grief. But I always think that the response to me is more important than the whatever growing number of undergraduates who are easily offended. I think that this is actually what do we make of this? What do we do with this? And if it is anything like a trend, if it's not isolated incidents and it is the beginnings of some zeitgeist changing, more so than ever, I think that the role of the professor is, I think we've failed our students if by the end of our classes, for instance, they still don't. I think part of the training of, say, a seminar in mine is for students to come out of there comfortable with expressing opinions and not vilifying others who they disagree with. And I think that the response to any claims of alarm and these trends or whatever being dangerous ought to be met with open and clear conversation with our students, and not with a response that it's just these students who are like completely progressive liberals on the left who are ruining things because of postmodernism. I would want to talk to that student, to bring them in, let them teach by example what it means to have a respectful disagreement.
The issue with postmodernism connects us to another item that many have suggested we talk about. And I think this is something that you slammed me for on one of your podcasts, the conceptual penis hoax. Is there a mess we need to clean up there?
I don't think we slammed you on the podcast about that.
Well, what happened is I was among the people who forwarded this hoax. I think I read a piece of their paper on my podcast and then retweeted it. And then many people have now judged it to have been a false hoax, or at least a misfired hoax. I mean, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but I think you guys saw it as an example of skeptics not being nearly skeptical enough because they just practiced their own version of confirmation bias by spreading this thing, which in the end wasn't what it seemed to be. Is that still how you think about it? Because I think
Yes.
the authors both defended themselves, right? And I think even Alan Sokol wrote a fairly appreciative piece about it, or at least a partially appreciative piece about it.
I think what was like, and we had James Lindsay on our podcast, and we talked at length. We talked at length about it, and I think that not that I'm encouraging you to listen to it, but at the end of that, I was more disappointed with his response than ever. And I think it is a case where we were taking to task many in the the whatever skeptic community, if you want to call it that. I don't know how you feel about the label. For falling prey to confirmation bias. And I think our point was just generally that this was, published in a really low-tier journal after being rejected from a mid-tier journal. And I thought, well, what would be evidence of a good scholarship if not being rejected
that was a point that cut against
from
it,
journals?
From an unranked journal. They were rejected from an unranked gender studies journal and got it published in a pay-per-publish, not gender studies journal.
It requires no defense of gender studies. I mean, I think we're all on record as saying there's like spectacular bullshit coming out of some of these fields. But there's something about the arrogance and the quickness of mockery. And this is something I want to talk to you. This is your podcast, so you can direct us. But I did want to talk to you about in this broader context of moral persuasion about the role of this mockery. And I don't think I've been struck, maybe especially in the last few weeks or few months, as our audience has grown and we get more and more people interacting with us on Twitter. I don't know if it's just some belief that this is an effective way of convincing others of the truth, but I found the authors, or at least the one author we talked to of the hoax, to be very dismissive and quite arrogant about the way that he presented his case in a way that Sokol himself was not, right? And I find, for instance, you to be very reasonable when you talk, but you have a wide army of people who aren't that way. And so I don't know how you feel about when you see, you probably get so many tweets that it's hard to keep up, but when you see people
Right.
who sort of on your behalf are acting in ways that I don't think that you would ever act.
There are really two topics here. One is whether mockery is ever useful and persuasive to the people you're mocking, or whether I think you guys have even more global doubts about whether just hard criticism is ever persuasive to the people you're criticizing, whether a frontal assault, atheist style, on religious faith ever wins hearts and minds. I think that's something that at least Tamler has doubted in the past.
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by frontal assault, but
Then there's the issue of how one's fans or listeners or readers, in my case, represent me in how they respond to people who criticize me or my podcast guests. And on that second point, for me, it's very clear, and I've, with some frequency, I mean, I can't keep doing this, but with some frequency, I admonish my listeners not to be jerks. And I've said on a few podcasts, listen, you're doing me no favors, no matter how much you hate what someone said on my podcast, no matter how wrong you think they are, you're not doing me any favors if you now just flame them on social media. I don't want a person's experience coming on the podcast to be that was the worst thing they ever did in their lives because of how they were treated by a fairly large audience. In fact, I want it to be the opposite. I want everything that comes their way to be really smart and civil, no matter how hard-hitting it actually is, or no matter how critical it is of their position. It has to be civil and relevant. And so, yeah, I'm fairly clear about how I wish people would represent my audience.
Right.
But I have very little control over what people actually do, apart from saying things like that periodically.
I guess and there's, right, you don't have control over what the people who are fans of yours do, and all you can do is model good behavior, which I think you did. I mean, you did in the Scott Adams, almost to the point where it was heroic, the degree to which.
We'll see if I can still model it, and now that we talk about
it. But so
there's some Christakis level patience.
But the question that Dave alluded to before about whether mockery is an effective tactic to change people's minds, I think is it's something that I think skeptics and sometimes atheists, I guess maybe I just disagree with them because I don't have any great evidence on whether mockery changes minds or not. Certainly in my experience, mocking somebody, calling them stupid, calling them, obviously irrational or whatever, is not it just makes people more defensive. It makes people dig their heels in more. And the way I think to change minds is to be respectful of their opinion and to really try to, see the best side of it and to engage with it, even if you find it indefensible on some level, just as a purely practical instrumental goal of changing somebody's mind. In my experience as someone who's no stranger to mockery, that's not what I want to trot it out for. Mockery is fun, can be funny. It can get the people who already agree with you to agree with you more and to be more proud of themselves for being on the right side of the view, but it doesn't change the minds of the people that you're mocking.
I would just say that that assumption is pretty readily disconfirmable. I mean, it doesn't change some people's minds. I'll grant you that. It might not even change most minds, and most minds, depending on what the belief system is, might just not be available for change, right? So there's nothing you're going to say on a podcast or in a book, however well-tempered, that's going to change the mind of a real jihadist or get him to question his faith. But I've been amazed to learn that some of the most hard-hitting stuff I've put out there, the stuff I've said about Islam and the end of faith or in various YouTube videos, has actually penetrated and reached even totally devout conservative people in communities in Pakistan, right, where the people are now closet atheists, right, based on what I or Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens have said about their religion. And obviously that's not, those people themselves must be outliers, but you have to picture people at every point on the spectrum of credulity with respect to any ideology. And so there are the people who are, fundamentalists and have never questioned the faith, and there are people who are halfway between that and being, fairly just nominal adherents of the faith. And they can be tipped in either direction. And if they see something very hard hitting, but also obviously well thought out, directed at this thing that they have been told is so important and so beyond doubting, you don't know how many of those people you capture. And I can just say that, having done this for more than a decade, there's personally a kind of an endless stream of confirmation that minds get changed through confrontation with evidence and argument, however actually disrespectful and hard-hitting.
And I maybe there were some distinctions that came to mind as we continue to talk about this, and one is that I don't, at least what I know of the discussions that you've had, haven't struck me as mockery. And I find even in instances of strong disagreement, I don't think that you are disrespectful, but I think that the question of whether mockery is effective may be just the wrong way for me to think about it, because it may very well be that you change some minds through mockery, but that isn't the way that I want to do it. And maybe there are some tactics that just are so, I mean, there are some issues that are so important that you might adopt a by any means necessary approach, but I find it distasteful and disrespectful. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how we define mockery, but so for instance, the way I speak about Trump, right? Well, this is not everyone's cup of tea. I mean, obviously, Trump supporters who are totally incorrigible hate what I say about Trump, and they must be unreachable. But I got to think even there, it reaches somebody, and on certain points, there is just no other way to say it. I mean, to fail to convey the feeling of moral opprobrium that seems to me just central to the response I'm having to Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, to leave that off the table is to actually not communicate what I think about Trump and what I feel everyone has good reason to believe about him. So I guess the respect side comes in where I can give a sympathetic construal of why someone didn't see it that way at first, or maybe even doesn't see it that way now. And I can certainly sympathize with someone who hated Clinton and felt, for their own reasons, that Trump was probably a better choice. There's definitely a discussion to be had that they can dignify the other side. And I spent a whole podcast running down Clinton with Andrew Sullivan, so I'm sympathetic with the other side. But to actually just focus on a specific example like Trump and Trump University, as I did with Scott Adams, and to not express just how despicable that was and how despicable it is not to find it despicable now. I was somewhat hamstrung in my conversation with Scott because I have to play host and debate partner, but kind of the host has to win. At least I'm using it as a heuristic now that the host has to win in those moments and keep it civil at all costs. But to give him a pass on that, I feel, is a moral failing in itself and an intellectual one. So, and to not communicate that is dishonest.
I guess what you did with Scott Adams is, as I see it, different. You weren't mocking him. You weren't. I'm not saying you shouldn't express your feelings or you should sugarcoat how you feel and what you believe about Donald Trump. But when you look at what you did with Scott Adams, you were very deliberately trying to see his perspective, trying to understand why he was defending the positions that he was defending. And I don't know, like I see that more as an example, even though he wasn't going to be persuaded either way. I see that as an example of more what I'm talking about than what you're talking about. And I think this is what doesn't happen with Trump, with liberals and Trump voters, is they are dismissed in like the basket of deplorables. They're just dismissed as this monolithic group of racist idiots who vote against their own interests constantly. And
just to be clear, I'm highlighting not what I said to Scott or about Scott, but what I say about Trump. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I am being as disrespectful as you can possibly be about Trump. So imagine what I would have to say to Trump to his face if I ever met him to square with what I've said.
I'm talking about a Trump voter and trying to convince a Trump voter to change their mind. Say, we get to the next election time and you're canvassing with a Trump voter, the way to change their mind both as a party and as an individual person isn't going to be, I don't think, to make fun of them, because that's what was tried. And that's what seemed like almost a galvanizing, it had a kind of a galvanizing effect to the voters.
But what do you think of something like the SNL sketches against Trump and Sean Spicer?
Yeah. So I was good. This is what I was going to get to another distinction about humor, because there's not a clear line, and all I can do, I think, is point to the sort of attitude that somebody holds toward another human being, where humor is actually a great way to satirize and to condemn. And by the way, I also agree with you that what I'm not saying is that there aren't cases of just sheer moral condemnation, that we shouldn't pull our punches. We should be very, very comfortable to say, I agree with you. I think Trump is somebody who I wouldn't have anything good to say about him. And I think so much of what he's doing is wrong and setting the wrong example. And with humor, I think humor, there is often a line there. And I find that I can distinguish the kind of humor that I think is good satire for me in my reaction from stuff that just gets nasty in some way in the tone with which it's being done. And I think the power of humor is that it tells a truth in a way that disarms people. It doesn't bring their walls up. Not always, but it has the power to do that. Right? I think I've gotten so much more insight from people like Dave Chappelle and Louis C.K. because they tell some pretty difficult truths in a funny way. I think though that it can get to a mean spirit, and then I just don't like it as much. But I don't like that feeling that somebody's disrespecting. And I think when I said mockery, for instance, what I meant was somebody who is unwilling to engage. And I found, I think in our James Lindsay interview about the hoax, I found an unwillingness to engage, or just a stopping point at their willingness to talk about opposing views. That is what distressed me, or what bothered me, I guess.
I haven't listened to that, so I'll have to
Yeah.
do that. So let's open it up to this larger issue of moral persuasion. And this follows rather directly from what Scott Adams was claiming on my podcast, that Trump is this brilliant persuader, and that persuasion is really not about facts and needn't be about facts. I mean, it's not a bad thing that it's not about facts. This is one thing that, again, in my role as host, I couldn't fully communicate how reprehensible I feel this position is. And I mean, I'm not saying anything about Scott that I wouldn't say to him. It's just hard to kind of split the baby in real time when you're on your own show. And I say this now, fully aware that it will get back to Scott. But I just feel like he seemed totally comfortable. In fact, he seemed fairly jubilant about caring not about what is true, but about what people can be led to believe. It just matters what people can be led to believe. Don't you understand, Sam? That's the game we're all playing. That's what this life is about. It's about persuading people to get what you want out of life. And Trump is great at that. And that, as a kind of the linchpin of an ethical worldview, there's so much wrong. I mean, where do I start? That everything is wrong with that. As a scientist, as a philosopher, as a journalist, as a compassionate person who just wants to have his or her beliefs track reality. I mean, whoever you are, attempting to build a better society, I don't see how you can be comfortable with that as your starting point. And yet, I mean, he does have a point. I mean, the fact that, one thing that was astonishing after our podcast was to see how differently our two respective audiences perceived it. I mean, my audience vilified him, and his audience vilified me. And I mean, it was clear that they thought he had destroyed me. What an embarrassment. It was like career suicide for me to have someone as brilliant and as persuasive as Scott on my podcast to just, do the Jedi mind trick on me.
By the way, we've had some of your followers listen to our long podcast on free will and say, Sam destroyed you guys. And I always sort of laugh because I'm like, I don't think that the destruction
But I did destroy you guys.
Yeah. I was like, I think that
that was me. I have another account.
You have like an account with 6 followers.
The Scott Adams interview, it's a funny thing to listen to. You get kind of disoriented, and there was a kind of postmodern feel to it. There was a kind of postmodern critical theory kind of perspective that he seemed to be inhabiting with facts and reason-based arguments, or at least sort of, objective reason-based arguments that could be independently evaluated, just didn't play the role for him that it plays for you, and that it's, mostly we think plays for all of us. And there was a meta level as trying to, when you two would debate, say, the Russia investigation or climate change, and he would say, well, the Paris deal was a hoax, and you weren't, but Trump said climate science was a hoax, and all of a sudden we're shifting terrain. And then you start to wonder, is Scott Adams treating this very debate as something to be like a vehicle for persuasion? Not of you. He probably knew that you weren't going to be persuaded, but so he's not trying to win the argument or the debate in the sense that we understand that. He's trying to do what he says Trump is a master at doing, which is persuade people to appreciate Trump or to find something in him that they haven't found before. And then it was like, now it's like, how do you assess this argument at all if he's not even trying to win the argument as I understand winning arguments,
No, I think that's true. I think he's very sincere about his insincerity. I think he's got this bad faith structure to his game, and he's fine with that. And I feel that there is an immense number of intellectual and ethical problems that follow from that. And we couldn't fully get into it, but I do find it very frustrating. But in his defense, the aftermath and just everything we see around us proves at least one part of his thesis, the 2 movies analogy. Our audiences, my audience and Adams's audience, were clearly watching different movies of that podcast and perceived it totally differently. And the question of moral persuasion. How do you bridge that gulf? Honestly, I'm at a loss when you can't get facts that would be morally salient in another context to matter to someone for the purpose of a political discussion. I mean, like when one point I made with him, to which he didn't have a rebuttal. I mean, I think he basically agreed with me. I said, listen, if I did any one of these things that I just named, that you're not disputing Trump has done, if I did any one of these things, it would be the end of me, and for good reason. I mean, you would not come on this podcast if you had heard that I had a Trump University in my backstory, or if I had been, barging into the dressing rooms of the beauty pageant contestants under my sway, or I mean, any of these things. And you would rightly recognize that I'm a schmuck who shouldn't be taken seriously. He does sort of split the difference here, and in other moments he says, well, who am I to judge any of that? And I'm not the Pope. And when he's talking about Trump, he's
Or he says, oh, well, he's lived more publicly than you, sort of implying that who knows if
who
you
knows
would have
what,
walked
yeah,
in.
exactly. But I do wonder about someone who feels that he is in no position to judge the litany of abuses to morality and reason we see just pouring out of Trump's life.
I think his better argument was that you shouldn't, like, we're not hiring him to be a model citizen, good behavior. It's like you want that dirty lawyer, or as Dave would say, the Jew lawyer, to win your case for you.
God,
You don't
character assassination.
You don't want the lawyer that's the most upstanding citizen when you're in a battle, for your, whether you're going to go to prison or not, or for a lot of money.
There's so much to disagree with him about, but I'll tell you what I found the most distressing, and again, I actually found him to be like an interesting, respectful dude when he was discussing. So I reserve the right, as Sam, you were saying before, to just fundamentally disagree with him. And what I found the most distressing in the whole interview was, as you point out, the amorality of his arguments, but another one, just the insistence on praising Trump for his persuasive powers and an unwillingness to
Right.
talk about what he was persuading people about. That he was avoiding any discussion of content. So it's fine if you want to
getting what he wants, and that's an intrinsic good.
An intrinsic good, and it made me think. For some people this is an insult, some people it might be a compliment. But it was very Ayn Randish, and I was struck by that being a good in and of itself. That sort of we've reached 33rd level persuasive powers, and so you got to admire the guy. But if your persuasive powers are being used to not care about the future of the environment, or to discriminate against people or whatever, how is that a good? I mean, but you couldn't get him to discuss that, and it was always bringing it back to, well, this is just part of his masterful game, which is like, great, you might be a really, really great marksman, but if you're shooting people, I don't like you. But at this point, he would tell me, well, I failed because my use of analogy. But I think I found it, when it's all said and done, I found it almost monstrous to think of a president and endorsing him for doing that, for being good at that.
Yeah, well, yeah. Also, not to see the cost. But forget about what he's persuading people toward. The fact of just having this style of communication that is so dishonest that more or less there's just every assumption now is that there's something false in what he said. Even if you're his fan, you have to bracket everything he says with this basic uncertainty about whether he means it, and the cost of that to our society and to our politics. The downside of that is so obvious, but he clearly doesn't care about it.
Your question about, there are these two movies, and the movies seem to be operating according to different principles too, just in terms of what counts. If the whole the media takes Trump literally, but not seriously. People take Trump seriously, not literally. And it's like, and I guess that serious part on the Trump voters is that idea of kind of emotional trust, or they trust him emotionally, and so when he goes off on some bullshit tweet storm, they know it's bullshit. They know he's lying, but he has their emotional trust. I mean, I think that there is something right about that, at least as a descriptive explanation for what's going on. And
I actually think that's mostly untrue. I mean, I think I want to call bullshit on that claim too. I mean, for instance, when Trump gets up there and says, my inauguration crowd was bigger than any that had ever been seen, I think most of his fans think that's true when he says it, and they think it's the fake news media out to get him that is disputing it. And if they ever come around to being convinced by the photos, which, half of them probably think are doctored, they think, well, who gives a shit? He's great anyway. And so it's like
but why do they say he's great anyway? Because they trust him. They trust him. He's a fighter. He's a businessman. He's going to fight for their...
the way Scott views him is a very unusual way of viewing him. I think they think everyone's out to get him, so that most of the criticism about him and most of the fact-checking has to be purely malicious, and most of that is just a tissue of lies and conspiracy theories, and there's probably nothing untoward happening with Russia. And he's almost certainly this really good guy who's just getting hammered by the left-wing elite. But then when any one piece of this shifts into the certainty column, where, okay, no, Trump clearly was lying there, then they have a piece of the Scott Adams view, which is, well, who cares? He's just, that's just for effect, or that works. He did it because it works. Get used to it. But for the most part, I don't think that's not their first perception. The first perception is he's just under attack. There's a siege, and it's driven not by how far from normal and ethical and professional and competent he is. It's driven based on just pure partisan rancor. I mean, people like me are just unhappy to have lost an election.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're right about that. I guess I didn't want to build too much on the psychology of the Trump voter as much as in terms of getting people in that movie to sort of be able to talk and debate. There is something in this idea of building emotional trust, and one of the reasons why the fake news, liberal, skewed, biased media, all those charges seem so effective. They're very effective on convincing Trump voters that he's being treated unfairly, as he loves to say, is because there is no trust right now for those kinds of institutions. The establishment Republicans, the establishment Democrats, and the news media in general. And so that's I think the work that has to be done is building some of that trust back, because without that, there's no terrain to persuade people to revise their opinion of a man that they've put a lot of stake in. A lot of these voters, they are really motivated to not look like they got played for a sucker, to not look like they've been conned. And so only somebody who they have a tremendous amount of trust in, and also I think some degree of respect for, is going to be able to make progress in changing their minds about that, because there's a lot of biases.
I think you're being. I don't think that there is that the liberal media has eroded trust, and that this is why the people went for Trump. I think it's a much simpler story, which is he was saying shit a lot of people wanted to hear. They were voting in their self-interest for Trump because they really believed it. And one way to take Scott Adams' view is, and I agree with both of you, I don't think that Scott Adams represents in any way the average Trump supporter. One way in which I think he's right is that Trump has persuaded a substantial portion of people that he is to be trusted. And I think that is despite all of the evidence that he is not to be trusted. And so you say to yourself, well, how can people trust him despite all of this evidence that he's a liar, that he makes decisions based on self-interest, not even on principle? And I think it's because he has said a few things that people really, really wanted to hear. And I don't think it's the liberal media has eroded trust and it needs to build it back up. I think it's just totally directional bias.
Well, the thing is, though, it has, I mean, I can attest to the failings of the liberal media or the mainstream media on certain topics that are so reliable that I do have a window into how a right-wing Fox and Breitbart fan could view the editorial page of the New York Times or even just the news pages, because I've seen them commit errors of fact or to shade their discussion of facts so reliably on certain topics. I mean, the topics of, the link between Islam and terrorism is one where I can just guarantee you I will find in an article some way in which political correctness is distorting the presentation of stark facts. There are whole articles in places like the New York Times talking about terrorist suicide bombings as though the motive were a mystery that is bound to remain impenetrable till the end of time. And there's no mention of Islam. There's no mention of religion. There's just, you have generic words like extremism. And all of this, to someone who's been paying attention to this problem and is worried about the spread of specific ideas relative to jihadism, it's a very fishy way to describe what's going on. And so it is with something like gun control and gun safety. I mean, there'll be a shooting at a school, and you'll have the response in the New York Times, and you'll just see you'll see positions being articulated by people who know nothing about guns, who have never shot a gun, who get everything wrong. I mean, the names are wrong. I mean, when you hear them on CNN talking about guns, they pronounce the names of gun manufacturers wrong. I mean, it's just the level of cluelessness is so obvious. And so I can see that it's possible that even in the valid reaction to Trump, there's something demeaning about having to respond or feeling that you have to respond again and again and again to Trump's dishonesty and indiscretions, because every time you do it, you're running the risk of making an error yourself, however small, which seems to put you on all fours with Breitbart or with Trump himself, or it's just that there's something that erodes your credibility by just taking the time to be endlessly criticizing someone like this for the same points. And so when you look at the New York Times now, there are days where the whole paper looks like the opinion page because they have to take a position against this guy.
Yeah, it's a horrible state of affairs. I hate life. But I will say this: I think you're giving too much credit to the truth-seeking nature of people. I don't at all disagree that there's.
Well, that's Adams's point. I mean, in defense of Adams, that's exactly what he would want to say.
Well, I mean, but I think he's wrong in that this is a. I mean, I think everybody should be truth-seeking. I think people are wrong to take Trump at face value and believe him. But so I don't. I think. Yeah, he's totally wrong about the moral virtue in this. But I think that when people see an article on gun control in the New York Times and they disagree with it, I don't think that they're trusting the factual. I don't think these people are like, well, look at the most recent statistics and I can show you where you're wrong. I think they're like, I like guns and New York Times doesn't, so fuck you guys. That to me is not erosion of trust. That is just directional bias on all parts.
Some people can recognize bullshit when they see it, and if you're a big pro-gun person and you see the position being misrepresented, you'll recognize that, and that will piss you off, and rightly so.
Yeah, but those same people will have. It's not as if they're more sensitive to facts or something, right? So those same people. I mean, this is the whole point of motivated reasoning. When you spot an argument that you don't like and then you dig into it, then you're going to find evidence and maybe you can say, well, the New York Times is biased. But when they say something that is that is consistent with your belief, you won't do any. You'll just be like, yeah, that's right. But I don't think that. I mean, I think that this is something that's been going on forever with the media and the way that people process information. I don't think it's anything that has eroded in the trust of the people who once thought the New York Times could give them genuinely unbiased facts about gun control, and now they can't. And so I'm going to vote for Trump. I think it's just way more gut reaction than that.
But so what do you do with this underlying claim, which you did just echo, that people are not as truth-seeking as they should be, or that I think they could be?
I'm depressed about it, Sam. I mean, I think that this is actually one of the things that I want to talk about is at what point, when talking about moral persuasion, right? So I feel like I've fought the good fight in discussing things, and I'm willing to keep fighting it for that percentage of people. So sometimes I look at my classroom and I say, if maybe I can get 5 people to reason a bit more out of 50, then I'll consider this a victory. But one of the things that maybe both of you can give me your opinion on is, at what point I've realized, I think maybe it's maturity and maybe it's just growing impatience, that there is a stop rule. At some point, before turning into mockery, I want to just stop engaging because it won't be worth my time. There are people I know who I know won't be convinced, and they're not worth my, despite my my being reactive on Twitter to some trolls. I feel like, well, maybe I just need to be more pessimistic about human nature and not even engage them.
But then there's this set of people who are, there is something you could do to bring them around. They're not currently around. And there's a set of people you could, move closer to. And this is, we've seen this on the podcast. People email us all the time and said, you actually changed my mind about this issue, that issue. And I don't know, that's what, I agree that there's plenty of room for pessimism on this question, but certainly not despair.
Well, so David, I don't know how close you are to this research, but there certainly is some scientific research on persuasion and just how hard it is to change people's minds, and things like the backfire effect, and all the biases that Kahneman and Tversky have brought to the world's attention. If someone wanted to create a fully scientific approach, or an approach that's grounded in the best research now to changing minds, do you know what that would look like? I mean, because there are these perverse things, like if I tell you something that is not true, there's this, I don't know how well replicated this has been. Again, we have this replication problem too with some of these results, but like there's the illusory truth effect, where if your first hearing of something is only in the context of hearing that in fact it's not true, a disproportionate number of people will remember it as being true merely for having heard it. So how do we hack our minds based on current science?
It's funny because I'm currently in Toronto, and one of the things that I do on the side is this consulting work where we try to apply the science to changing consumer behavior, and I'm often have to struggle with, there are the ways in which you can try to change someone's mind that I think are good ways, like trying to find the ways in which people will be more willing to listen to and grok sort of an argument that is opposed to their initial argument. And then there are the ways that are, say, like the dumber ways, the ways that don't require reasoning, that are just sort of like, say an emotionally distressing image in order to get you to stop smoking or something like that. And so I always, and even my own research on disgust, I've had liberals ask me, how can I use disgust to make people more in line with the liberal ethics instead of with conservative ones? And I always say, I don't think that's the way we should be using it. But the question of how to get people's mind change, especially in the moral domain, it's a tough one, and I've vacillated between sort of downright despair and just regular pessimism. But I do think that the best way is in the context of relationships and respectful, friendly relationships. And so I'll say it this way: John Haidt, I think, is on to something when he talks about the need to build relationships, have social relationships in order to make some of this stuff actually work. And you brought up gun control earlier, and I'll use an example from my own life. I was I'm fairly liberal, right? And perhaps even in my sort of becoming a psychologist, I was extra liberalized. And when I went to grad school, I took a course in normative ethics from a philosopher, and he turned out he was a gun owner and had very, very specific libertarian views on gun ownership. And I had just knee-jerk reaction against this. I thought, this is horrible. How can you promote this? And, citing studies about the mere presence of guns making people more violent. And because I became his friend and because I respected him in all sort of other ways in which he had demonstrated to me that he was a reasonable person, I was left with, wow, it's weird that a reasonable person believes something about this that's so contrary to my view. And he exposed me to literature, and I started reading, and I actually changed my mind about, at the very least, now I try to look at objective evidence, which, as you say, is very hard to get. But it was only in that context, because I think that if anybody else had just told me that I was an idiot for believing what I believed, I would just double down. And I think that it's a really high bar, but it's the one that seems to work. It's people from your group who you respect, who you can say to yourself, that's weird that I agree with this person about so much, but in this case, what is there? What is it that's there? And Twitter is horrible at, Twitter is the opposite. Most ways that we have of communicating that are new are not that.
This is why Trump is a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, his success is a bit of a mystery. And again, this is something that does fall into line with Adams's account, that he has something miraculous going on with him, because you have the leading lights of the Republican Party, right? Like all the journalists and all the opinion people. I mean, certainly the smartest ones. I mean, these were all never Trumpers. The National Review, the magazine itself, came out against him, right? So you have people within their group saying, okay, listen, we hate Clinton as much as you do, but this guy is a monster. And it means nothing. It apparently means nothing to the rest of the Republican base. So maybe that was just the establishment Republicans were viewed not as insiders but as outsiders. I mean, they're just more elitists, so they're the same thing as Clinton. They're all at Davos together, eating canapes, and they're all part of the problem. And Trump is the middle finger raised in the direction of that problem.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of evidence that, they were as disgusted with the mainstream establishment Republican Party, not as they were with Hillary. That was a different level, but, that they didn't trust them, and they still don't trust them. And Trump is the first president or candidate that they felt in a while was on their side. They thought both parties had sort of.
But how is he one of them?
I
When you look,
Yeah.
look at photos of his apartment.
It's mind blowing.
I mean, this is what's insane.
Yeah.
Look at photos of his apartment. I mean, this has been described as Baathist chic. It literally looks like one of Saddam Hussein's imperial palaces.
Yeah, what's with gilded stuff what is tracked by that aesthetic preference that includes Donald Trump and Saddam Hussein?
Well, I mean, so I think the best thing that somebody said about that was, even though he's so rich and he's so clearly not a working class person in Ohio, he gets sort of mocked and dismissed and made fun of like them. And so, and even for his garish, tasteless style, like that. So I heard some interview, and I don't remember where this is from, where when the people, he said, when the people are insulting Trump and mocking him and calling him an idiot, and he's like, it's like they're saying that about me. That was just a voter, and it wasn't like, so it was the same people that they think look down on them also look down on Trump.
Right, and I guess his garishness is still aspirational for some people. I mean, I think I said at one point, and this no doubt offended somebody, that Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person. This is what it looks like to make it, right?
So I may be more cynical or maybe more liberal, but I think that there's a straightforward story about how Trump succeeded, and it was his willingness to say things that were just under the surface of many Americans. And not coincidentally, these Americans are just the ones who know how to vote and are willing to go out and vote. They're not disenfranchised. They're just disillusioned. I think I said this at some point on our podcast. There was a guy who came on and said, let's get rid of Mexicans and Muslims, and and black people are getting a little uppity and women are just complaining about stuff. And at the risk of sounding crass, I think that's the message that resonated with a large base. Now, why do people feel that way? I think we could talk about that, but I think that's what got. I mean, remember, he barely won, right? So all he had to do was get. I mean, how many I don't know how many Trump supporters but the ones that I know were like just in general white dudes who kind of didn't like Mexican people taking all the jobs, and I got to call a spade a spade. Like, that's what I saw.
I said this before on the podcast. I mean, it's one sign of what a bubble I'm in that of all the people I know, I think there are only two people who I am reasonably sure voted for Trump. I mean, this is of like all the people, if my life depended on it, I had to physically find a Trump person, and maybe it's 1,000 people or so that in my contact list, right?
Just go to La Jolla.
And one is Peter Thiel. So it's like I have to reach to Peter Thiel to find someone who
he's so
who voted for
representative
Trump in my world.
of the Trump.
The people,
The person who cut my
Exactly.
hair, I kind of feel like we shouldn't keep talking about Trump, but the person who I'd been going to cut my hair for a really long time, I found out after the election had voted for Trump, and fairly enthusiastically. And she was not what Dave is describing. She was of Mexican descent herself. She she's been at war with her very religious in-laws over custody for her son. So they live in East Texas, and so she's no friend to religion. She's very pro-LGBT. And so, I mean, I think there's just so many different reasons. There's some element that's what Dave is talking about, but I think it's dismissive to attribute that to another also significant percentage of Trump voters. But to broaden it, when you're talking about moral persuasion and how hard it is because everyone's vulnerable to all these biases, and it can start to feel like you're kind of starting from the assumption that you have the right view, and the challenge is how to get everybody to kind of agree with you because you're right. And I don't mean you two, but like this is sort of the premise of these discussions sometimes. And I think a lot of times we are not sufficiently reflective about our own biases and the ways in which we're vulnerable to the same kinds of things that provide barriers to convincing other people. And that, I guess that's a separate issue, but it's, I think, one that is important to sort of demonstrate, if you want to bring other people around to your side, is to show that you are sufficiently reflective about your own views.
That you're sensitive to, yeah.
That's obviously valid for debating any topic, except there are clear cases where you're right, and the burden really is upon you to prove it, right? Like you're trying to get through to somebody who who you'd bet your life is wrong here or is not seeing something. This happens in the intellectual sphere when you're just trying to get someone to understand, probability or anything that you may have well in hand and they don't. But I think it also is true of certain moral things. There's a moral cost that the other person is not recognizing, and you are sure this is something that should be recognized, and you're trying to go to the mat for it, and you can't pretend to be unsure of your position there. Maybe you're saying that you should have a kind of pretense of not being sure as a way of using more honey than vinegar for the purpose of persuading. Is that as a strategy as opposed to your actual epistemological view.
I mean, you're right that there are some cases like that, but I don't know how great we are at identifying which are those cases and which are the ones that we actually are getting a little, we are a little too confident in our opinions.
One way of reading what Tamler's saying is not that you have to be unsure about your own position in this case, but maybe, and this ties into what I was saying about having sort of knowing somebody over time and realizing what kind of person they are, where you can. It means a lot, and one of the reasons that, if you'll recall, we had you on our 75th episode, and we had a bunch of people on to talk about what they had changed their minds about. I think it's important to be open about those instances where you can show people that you have been sensitive to truth and you have changed your mind.
I can't remember what I changed my mind about on that episode. I might have changed it back in the meantime.
It was about AI, actually. Another thing we've gotten requested.
Okay. No, I'm still there.
Yeah, and
still worried.
I got actually shit for in real time. I changed my mind from that conversation with you, and somebody was like, "I can't believe you changed your mind so quickly," and like somehow I had laid down, and I was like, "No, I just was convinced." Like that happens. Maybe it didn't take much, but that conversation did convince me to be worried in a way that I hadn't been worried. And so showing people that you're capable of that, and the truth is to always, I think I'm all constantly worried that I am part of the problem. Not constantly enough, but have to remind myself that hey, if I haven't really taken a critical look at my own views in a while, that I'm not falling into that.
Yeah, one thing I think Adams, I just feel a duty to give the most charitable spin on his side here, which I'm pretty sure he would agree with. He would say that is a genuine weakness and a failing in a persuader. I mean, for you to be willing to second guess yourself in that way, it's like one of Trump's strengths is that he never does that. There's just no way he's ever going to conform to a criticism of him or express any kind of self-doubt. It may in fact be true that style of what is, from our point of view, a total lack of self-awareness, that actually wins fully half of any audience you're going to be in front of. You're already ahead of whoever you're dealing with if you are the guy who cannot be embarrassed about anything.
And will never admit that you're mistaken and will never apologize.
Yeah, I got that from Scott Adams, and when he said that very thing, I was like, well, then I just have a very different idea about what it means to be a person of moral character. Like, I don't want. I mean, maybe I'm with the 50% that doesn't want that. I agree. There's a way in which, yeah, sure, like you're a salesperson and you're working hard to get the best price, or whatever. Then fine. Like there's a pragmatic way in which that might work for some substantial portion of the people. I just don't want to inhabit a world in which that is what we value morally.
I'm a little skeptical that is as effective a technique, or even among Trump's more effective.
Yeah, me too. I mean,
techniques, and I don't know what the evidence is on that. So, Sam, you said earlier that you feel like sometimes that you're certain about a moral truth. So that was interesting to me, that you could be certain about some moral truth or moral fact, and your goal now is to convince other people to agree with you on that. Like, so how big is that category? Would something like abortion, the stance to be pro-choice or pro-life, is that one that you would that would be in the category or in the set of things that you think you're certain about?
At the extreme ends of the continuum, yes, but I would admit that drawing the line in gestation is difficult and is bound to seem arbitrary until all the facts are in, and maybe even when all the facts are in, it'll seem arbitrary. It's sort of like when you give someone a driver's license, what's the right age? But yeah, if you're going to say, is it okay to allow a woman to have an abortion when the fetus is, or the embryo is 2 days old, or is that the murder of a precious soul that has to be protected the way a fully developed human being would? That strikes me as absolutely clear cut. Now, whether you're talking about when you get me into the second trimester, well, then all of my concern about harming a sentient being kicks in. But so that that's a local case. But the more general case is I think that if what you are concerned about morally doesn't have to do with the actual or potential well-being of conscious creatures somewhere, sometime, if it's something else, right, that doesn't map on to the experience of beings that can suffer, well, then it's a pseudo-moral concern. I mean, then it's you're making a category error, or you care about something that you shouldn't care about. And
But a 2-month embryo or even a 1-month embryo has a potential for well-being.
yeah, so in the case of a 2-day-old embryo, right? I'm making it super clear. I think the interests of the mother and the kind of life she wants to live, her actual life, and the kind of life she thinks she can provide for this child that she doesn't want, if forced to have it. I mean, you can stack the deck. I mean, you can make the case for abortion as clear or as muddy as you want, and I agree that on both extremes, it can be very, very clear or very, very muddy. But if you give me someone we find out she's pregnant very early, and she really doesn't want the baby, I mean, it'll make it more extreme. She was raped, by her stepfather, right? Forcing her to bring this baby to term, I think that's clearly wrong given the amount of misery you're imposing on this actual woman. But I think, to connect this to another question, existential risk, I think, is a real ethical topic worth talking about. And there you are talking about the interests of uncreated people, right? It's like why would it be a bad thing if the lights went out on our species, painlessly all at once tonight, and there were no more people? What's the loss? None of us would suffer. None of us would know about it. We would just cancel human history or end it abruptly. Why is that bad? Well, the only answer there is that it's bad because all of these good things, all of these creative things, all of these beautiful things won't happen in that case. But that is a loss to no one who exists anymore.
So that's interesting, because one of the reasons I asked that question, I was listening back to an old podcast that Dave and I did on moral persuasion, and we read this article, and it was an article called, very famous in philosophy, Why Abortion is Immoral, by Don Marquis. And it was an argument for the pro-life position based on this idea of potential, that you are robbing a living creature of a future. And given that seems to be why we think killing is wrong in general, there's no reason for us not to think that it's wrong in this case. And it's a really just simple, elegant, and fairly effective argument, in that it's very hard to pin down where it goes wrong if it does go wrong. But Dave and I both, I mean, we're both pretty solidly pro-choice, and as much as we recognize that this was actually a fairly compelling argument against our position, we both had to kind of admit that it didn't change our minds in any way about.
Let me give you a test case. So I haven't read that paper, but I think I got it based on what you just said. And it does change my mind, or at least I recognize that it could totally change my mind given the right technological environment. So, for instance, if you made it very easy to remove this embryo, like painless, no risk to the mother, to remove this embryo and grow it up in a vat or in the womb of a surrogate or another woman who wanted it, then the woman's claim upon having an abortion, I think, evaporates pretty quickly. So if you have a pregnant woman who doesn't want this baby, but someone else does, and this baby presumably
You could transport it out with a transporter, right?
Yeah, we could transport it out or make it just very easy to remove, and then the argument that this is a viable life that is kind of interesting to the universe and has a claim upon itself, then I think that suddenly becomes hard to dispute. And then the pregnant woman's concern about, well, listen, I don't want to live in a world where I know I have this baby and now this son or daughter who I never wanted and who I'm now never going to meet. I just don't like the idea of it. Well, given the right changes in the environment and in culture, I feel like, well, that's defeasible. Then I think she might be in a position of someone who we would say, well, just get over it. This is not, doesn't really matter what you think. This is a person who exists now and has his or her own interests.
So is that so different in kind from her bringing the baby to term and immediately giving it up for
Well, no,
adoption?
it is because, well, one, bringing a baby to term is its own sort of life deranging experience, right? And every birth, as you know now, is still something akin to a medical emergency. It's crazy no matter how many doctors you have on hand. And then you have her experience of having to go through the whole ordeal of bearing a child that she doesn't want and giving it up at that late stage, in the presence of the infant now. And like you're imposing, if she says she doesn't want this at 2 days conception, if the state is imposing this on her, I feel like it's so much of an imposition that she has to be free to decide whether she's going to shoulder this burden. Especially if you make it very clear, like, she was raped, or, just to take the other associations that could be negative with taking this to term, then it becomes super clear to me. But you change enough, and then it changes.
So this gets us to something where, you said sort of you have a certain amount of moral clarity about the well-being of conscious creatures. I think that's absolutely right. I think the problem that that is illustrated by this topic is that I think a lot of people would think that that's actually the right way to approach morality. The question that becomes one of trade-offs, and when you start doing the calculus, that's where I think the disagreement sets in, where people who are pro-life, in some sense, it would be very weird to be pro-life in thinking that abortion is akin to murder and not being vocally opposed to it. Right? What kind of person would you be if you believed it was murder, and you were weighing pragmatic, the pragmatic sort of suffering of the mom? You would say, well, look, like that sucks, right? There's stuff that sucks in the world, but you can't just put a bullet in someone's brain because you're going to be uncomfortable. There's some level of risk that you're just going to have to accept. I think that's where all of the debate comes in, which is whose interests and how do we calculate them?
You can make it more extreme than that. The member of a mob reacting to a mere rumor of a Quran being burned, you could do a Vox Populi interview with him and say, what are you up to here? Why do you want to kill the person who may or may not have burnt this Quran? He could give the same story I just gave, and in consequentialist terms, he could say, listen, you have no idea how much I suffer upon hearing that a Quran was burned. This is the worst thing that has happened to me in 20 years, and I am defending my way of life and my worldview from these kinds of insults because they are so painful. So you put a pain meter on my brain, it's off the charts right now. What I would say to that is this person is suffering over the wrong things. To be wired in such a way by your culture and your belief system to be disposed to suffer over that kind of thing that much is to close the door to most of what's good about human life. All the other things, they could bring you joy, they could bring you enlightenment, they could relieve this unnecessary suffering and expose you to far more sublime range of experience, right? Like there's a lot you don't understand about how good life could be if you're part of a lynch mob chasing somebody who is rumored to have burned a Quran. To take my moral landscape analogy, this is clearly not a peak on the moral landscape. And if we're consequentialists, we should want to get to something as close to a peak as we can direct ourselves toward. And we just have a navigation problem. And lynch mobs organized around bad literature, that's clearly someplace we want to migrate away from and toward something, much more like the lives the three of us are attempting to live. and who knows how much better it could get.
You do have to
here,
layer.
but
You do have to layer then the argument, though, right? I mean, you have to say, well, it's not just about the welfare of conscious creatures. It is a particular way in which I think that we should assess this stuff. I mean, to get to an example that I think you very sort of wisely brought up with Scott Adams when you're talking about breaking into like the government sort of finding a nest of potential gang members and deporting them, right? I think the example was perhaps illegal immigrants who are gang members. And you say, well, look, maybe I have evidence that 3 of them are, 2 of them I'm not sure, but let's deport them all. I mean, you could use some sort of consequentialist calculus to easily say, in those cases, the risk to my country or my people or whatever is so high that it's worth the suffering of these individuals. And you pointed out, what if it's a mother of an 8-year-old child, and now you're ruining this child's life and you're bringing undue suffering upon the woman. It's what worries me is that under the guise of just plain consequentialist calculus, you can get yourself to sounding like the only assumption that you have is the welfare of conscious beings, and start arguing for some pretty.
it is my only assumption, and I think it is everyone's only assumption when you drill down on what they claim to care about. And this extends to even the craziest religious views where people are caring about whether they get into paradise. Well, why was it good to get into paradise, and why is it bad to go to hell? Well, still, you're talking about the well-being of conscious creatures. You're just not admitting it. And you're probably talking about fictional creatures. I mean, we run into this all the time with we have bureaucratic limits on how fine-grained our concern can be about individual suffering. We have to pass a law which decides a question one way or the other, and we know that there may be fairly tragic cases that fall on either side of that law or that policy, right? An insurance company has to deny certain claims, otherwise it couldn't be an insurance company. There will be edge cases that will make that insurance company seem fairly callous. It's just the slippery slope problems where if they spent their time tracking every single story, well then, they would go out of business and everyone would be worse off. I'm not sure insurance claims are the best example there, but there are certainly examples where you have to be coarse-grained and bureaucratic given the limits of human attention and resources, and that can seem in specific cases callous, but I think we're again, that only becomes intolerable when we can point to an extreme case of suffering that no one can countenance, and it only becomes acceptable when either we're ignorant of the suffering that no one should countenance, or it's a tolerable level of suffering, or we have just tacitly agreed to tolerate it collectively.
As we've been talking about the various consequentialist considerations one can raise for and against a particular position, I think one thing that we tend to overlook is something that John Haidt, or at least there's this position, and this is what John Haidt has argued for, when he's not slamming college students, is that we're very good at coming up with reasons afterwards to defend a position that we have already reached through the use of, our emotions or our intuitions. And, something like the abortion debate, it would be, that's not one that we come to with a blank slate and then we're just, at least I think we're fooling ourselves if we think we come to that with a completely open mind and then we're just weighing, the considerations of the future benefits of the child against the hassle and the potential suffering of the mother, and we're just doing that in a completely even-handed manner, and just however it all shakes out, that's the view that we're going to hold. I think Haidt is right that moral reasoning and just moral deliberation and the ways in which we arrive at our moral views and the ways in which we argue for our moral views or defend them or justify them is a lot more influenced by sort of your gut reaction that you had, and it can be complicated reasons why you have that gut reaction, but your gut reactions going in. And that was certainly the case with something like abortion for me. I was realizing when I was being honest with myself that I just wasn't going to be convinced out of the pro-choice position. I gained a lot of respect for the pro-life position, but I wasn't, that was as far as it's probably possible to take me with rational argument. I don't know if you agree with that. It sounds like something you disagree with, but that seems plausible to me that phenomenon is fairly widespread.
Well, there's a few issues here. I mean, one I think Haidt is probably right much of the time about most people. I think he's wrong a lot of the time about me with respect to how I reason, right? So I recognize that I'm not the conventional use case, or at least I don't think I am, and this could be self-deception.
This is exactly what his theory predicts you would
You're
believe
a robot,
about yourself.
Sam. You're a robot.
I'm one of the 95% of professors who believe they're above average.
That's right. It's sheer coincidence that you are.
But I mean, but I can point to examples where I'm pretty clear about how persuadable I am and why and what's actually anchoring me in cases like this. And I can change my position. I mean, so I've changed my position pretty starkly completely on pretty polarizing topics. I mean, like the death penalty, for instance. I'm now against the death penalty, whereas I was once for it, and I'm very in touch with why someone is for it. When I contemplate the case where it's most tempting, you give me the most evil person and you put me in the position of sympathizing with his or her victims, usually his, then I feel the lust for vengeance that everyone feels until I get a purchase on my whole worldview, when I actually think about the totality of the situation. So it's something I think what Haidt does is he significantly undervalues the potential of reason to change people's moral convictions. And he also, the flip side of this is, reason is itself not this bloodless calculating instrument. It is also built on very visceral intuitions about right and wrong and consistency and the need to remain consistent and finding certain propositions doubtful. I mean, I think doubt is an emotion. If you say something that sounds wrong to me and I feel, oh, no, that's not right, it feels like something to feel that way. And that's true whether you've given me an equation that doesn't add up or you've articulated a position that's at odds with how I remember the world to be yesterday or what I think follows logically from what you just said. Are detecting the most basic errors in anything is a felt, embodied experience. It's an emotional experience. So this opposition between reason and emotion, as many people have pointed out, doesn't hold much water when you actually look at it. But I just think you can reason yourself into fundamentally different positions and stay there and understand how you should weight your apish reactions that threaten to pull you out of it.
I have an embodied comfort with inconsistency.
Well, Tamler's perfected the art of not being bothered by inconsistency. I think that...
I mean, certainly I can feel the burden of consistency. I think it's overrated sometimes in moral debate, but that would take us very far afield.
The field I want to drag you upon also takes another podcast interview as its source, which is the interview you guys just did with Robert Wright about his book on meditation and Buddhism, which I think Robert's going to come on this podcast, probably not for a while, but I think maybe in a couple of months. The title of the book is Why Buddhism is True. So anyway, we have a lot to talk about potentially.
Bold claim.
But you guys seem fairly confused, I would say, about some of what he was claiming. I don't know that I agree with everything he said, but I think the takeaway message you guys got was that many of the things that are claimed in Buddhism or by people who spend a lot of time in meditation are at bottom paradoxical and really can't be rationally understood or just are always going to seem paradoxical, however you state them. And it's a matter of taking people at their word for their experience, but even when they're taken at their word, they can't really be asked to make a lot of sense. And that is very different from the way I see it and think I can talk about these things. So things like claiming
Just
the
to
self as an
clarify,
illusion.
I don't think we said that it was bound to lead to paradox, but that there is a comfort with paradox that many Buddhist people and Buddhist people who are trying to sort of explicate it, that they seem more comfortable with paradox than your ordinary person trying to explain something. And also that our language might impose some barriers in terms of trying to articulate some of the aspects of Buddhist thought, Buddhist notion of the self. That's at least what I believe.
I think that has been oversold significantly. I think the people who are most comfortable with paradox just don't know what they're talking about. I mean, they don't know that it actually can be explained clearly.
That's the fear that I always have, right? Where I'm like, well, at that point, how can I evaluate the truth, the truth claim about something that is inherently to tie into what we were just talking about, seems inherently contradictory, and it seems as if there is a view that this is a way to a deeper truth that can't be. There is a almost a view of a release from reason that might be, it might just be that particular strain of Zen that made its way to Western thought. But I do worry. I'm very open to that the experience of meditation and the sort of claims about not self. But I worry at that point that I don't have, without getting into exegesis of Buddhist texts, which I'm not interested in doing, about those claims that seem, at least on the face of it to me, to be inherently paradoxical and embracing a paradoxical view.
I think we should leave Zen aside because Zen has a kind of shtick, which is to use paradox to kind of stifle the conceptual mind. And it's true that a kind of relentless conceptualizing of experience is the thing, or one of the things you need to cut through in order to have the insights that are being talked about, insights into selflessness, for instance. And so it's a kind of method. It's sort of like it's almost like a Scott Adams style method of
Right.
just stopping that part of the conversation.
Very Zen.
Maybe Trump is a Zen master. He's a perverse Zen master. But in terms of the self being an illusion, that's not really a paradox. I mean, I feel like I can walk you through how that makes perfect sense in my world and doesn't entail any paradox.
Sure, I would love to hear that, and then while you're at it, tell me, please include how it leads you to care about other people more, because that's the part where I'm like, well, shit, maybe there are no selves, so why the hell do I care about collective suffering of selves?
One problem is that we use the word self in many different ways, and they really are different, and we don't recognize how the term is kind of sliding across topics. So, in one sense, selves are clearly not an illusion. I mean, so when I say the self is an illusion, I'm not saying that people are illusions. The self that is considered an illusion from the point of view of meditation and can be discovered to be such and felt to be such, and that can actually change the way you feel as a person in the world. It's not a matter of discovering that people don't exist. It's a matter of discovering that the feeling that you have of being a subject interior to the body, you're in your head, behind your face, riding around in your body as though it were a vehicle. This is the self that most people think they have. Most people don't feel identical to their persons. They don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they're, and to put, I think Paul Bloom uses this phrase, people are common sense dualists, where they feel like they're riding around as minds, as subjects inside the body, and they feel like they are the thinker of their thoughts, and that the thinker is something independent of the next thought just arising in consciousness. and they feel like they're an experiencer in the center of their experience rather than being merely identical to a sphere of experience. I mean, another word for this is the ego, the sense of there being a subject. And so that's the thing that is interrogated by a technique like meditation, and if done correctly, that's the thing that can be discovered to be absent, and it can be discovered in a way that's actually not paradoxical. I mean, you can talk about it in a way that can maybe sound paradoxical. You can say, well, how can the subject discover itself to be absent? But, well, the subject is an illusion. The subject is absent, right? This subject. Consciousness isn't an illusion. Thoughts aren't illusions. Perceptions aren't illusions. Everything is, all those things are actually appearing, but this felt sense that there's a center and an unchanging center in the middle of it, to whom all of that refers, which is appropriating experience in each moment, as though from outside of experience. That's the thing that can be undone through meditation. And then many things follow from that. But again, there's no paradox there.
Can I so ask a question about that? So I completely follow you. Obviously, I think I can understand that we're not dualist selves. And I don't even think, that's something that's certainly exclusive to Buddhism. Most scientists believe that. Most philosophers now believe that. I guess when you said a felt sense.
Just to clarify, Tamler, most Buddhists are effectively dualists, though. I mean, most Buddhists do think when you add to this picture the notion of rebirth, right? When the body and brain die, there's something, however inscrutable, that can propagate to a new circumstance. There is a kind of dualism there. I mean, they don't think consciousness and mind are reducible to brain chemistry. So
okay, so but when you said there is a felt sense, but there's no feeler anymore. So how is there a felt sense when there's no feeler?
Well, there is a feeler. The feeler is consciousness. To take this from the other side, this is actually one way in which the illusoriness of the self can be established logically. So, see if this makes sense. Everything to be noticed has to first appear in consciousness. I mean, to notice a sensation, to notice a thought, to notice a mood, it has to appear before the floodlights of consciousness. And the self, this feeling of self, is also appearing in some way. It has to have some signature. It has to feel like something to be I. I feels like something. Otherwise, we wouldn't use this word in this way. We wouldn't find it inscrutable to hear that there's no such thing as the self. And yet, by virtue of appearing in consciousness, that proves that consciousness is, in some sense, prior to it and transcendent of it. I mean, so it's just as you can see an object across the room, and by virtue of seeing it, not feel identical to it. And just as you can hear a sound, and by virtue of hearing it, having it appear as an object in consciousness, you realize that consciousness is prior to it. And just as you can see a thought arise and realize that, well, you're not identical to the thought because there it is. It's just a bit of language or just an image, and consciousness is over here prior to it. Well, so too with this feeling of self. That has to be appearing in some way. Otherwise, you would never claim to feel it. And again, this is not a way of having the experience. This is just a way of conceptually understanding it. Consciousness that is the feeler. It's just, it doesn't feel like a self because the thing that feels like a self is yet another thing that's appearing. It's a kind of contraction. It's a sensation in your face. It's a sensation in your chest. It's something. It's some signature by which you are reading this sense of I into a condition which is actually unstructured by that. It's just a sphere of experience where things are coming and going in every channel of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, and other sensations as well. You can add proprioception and perhaps other things we don't have names for, but there's just this flux without a center. The center is only implied. And when you look for the center, the feeling of there being a center can then genuinely drop out, and yet everything else remains. There's still sights and sounds, sensations, feelings, and thoughts.
So there are a few things that I think I need help with here, which so I agree. The dualism part I don't think is what at least I meant by self, because I accept that there is no special extra stuff that makes us a self. But what you might be saying is perhaps a couple things, perhaps both of them. So one, the notion of identity, what philosophers of identity might talk about, which is what is illusory is that that there is cohesion among the experience that can be boiled down to. So the feeling that I, David Pizarro, am the same David Pizarro was yesterday, and that I was 5 years ago, and when I was in fourth grade, that is a product of sort of just a mistake that is we are but collections of experiences, and it makes little sense to call these all one thing that is the David Pizarro. And so it could be that the sense of identity is illusory, but I still struggle with, even if I accept that, and I accept that, there's a way in which my language forces me to say I did this yesterday and I did this 10 years ago. Isn't it, what I can't shake is the sense that what I mean by self is that thing that is, as my sensory input is taking in information from my environment, I'm listening to both of you, and there is, I think, a very meaningful way in which those experiences are mine, and they're different from the experiences that you have. So there's that part, and then there's this other part which I think gets wrapped into this, which is an inflated notion of agency. That is, I am the locus of control over my own thoughts, which I can get why meditation reminds you that you are not in control. There is no thing that's in control of the thoughts, that you are but a collection of your thoughts. But take both of those away, the persistence of identity as an illusion, and the notion that there is a thing that is causing agency, causing you to think something. And I still am left with a meaningful sense of self that I take it as also being deconstructed here, which is that there is something meaningful about the senses that I have, the thoughts that I have, that you don't.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not taking issue with that. I mean, that I would not expect tomorrow morning to wake up as you.
That would be awesome for you.
I won't be surprised to wake up as me and not as you tomorrow morning, right? And I would be surprised insofar as, that it makes sense to even, I mean, it's kind of a Derek Parfit style thought experiment, because to wake up as you would not be to have the memory of having been me, right? It would be to have your memories, and then I wouldn't even notice. I would just be you. In fact, maybe this is what's happening all the time anyway.
Maybe we're doing that all the time.
But and in fact, that's actually
mind blown, Sam.
That's actually a position that did you ever read Erwin Schrödinger's book? Is it My View of the World? I think it's My View of the World.
No.
I mean, he was influenced by Vedanta, which is another way of talking about these things, but very close to the Buddhist view, despite the fact that Buddhists won't like that. He does talk about consciousness as simply the fact that anything is known. Everything that's particular to you is just being brought before the light of consciousness, and it's being known in the only place it can be known, where and as you are, as you. But this point of view of just knowing is truly generic and truly interchangeable. And it's, the only thing that's personal about you and your memories is just that collection of stuff that is changing over time where and as you are experiencing it. And that's the only place it can be experienced. But consciousness itself doesn't have this personal quality to it. I mean, that gets deconstructed in Buddhist thought in other ways. And there's this concept of emptiness, which is relevant here, where if you look at the evidence of your body and mind for something solid and unchanging that's really you, well, then you don't find it. I mean, you just find this flux. You find your body changing over time. You find your mind populated by stuff that you didn't author. There's just the fact that you follow the rules of grammar. It's just not something that you started. You have phrases that got into your head that you use, and you don't know where they came from. And in some ways, you're less similar with prior states of yourself than you are to other people in some respects, given that you've changed in various ways. And there might be periods in Derek Parfit goes into some of this stuff. These are paradoxes of identity, where you might remember something in your past very clearly, let's say when you're at age 4, but just not from when you were 19, say. And so how do you make sense of the fact that you have 0 episodic memories from that 1 year of your life, but you have them from another, which is more yourself? But the crucial issue of selflessness from a meditative perspective isn't at that coarse grain level of thinking about personal identity and trying to make it square with physics or with change or with anything else. It's this feeling, or its absence, of representing yourself in the world as this inner subject, as the thinker of thoughts, or ceasing to do that, and then being free of that feeling. And being free of that feeling has psychological consequences. And whether that happens for a second or an hour, there's a difference between being stable in this feeling or its absence, or just having brief glimpses of it. And then much of what is claimed to be transformative about meditation follows from there. I mean, that becomes relevant to the increasingly highfalutin claims people make about the promise of meditation, and things like enlightenment and Buddhahood and all the other things that begin to sound like religion. But there is something fairly radical to be understood here that is as clear and as on the surface as something like the optic blind spot. Whereas like if you didn't know about the blind spot and you'd never been taught to glimpse it, you would have no idea that this thing exists. But the moment someone shows you how to look for it, and then you see it, well, then it's undeniable, right? There's this part of your visual field that you are just not getting information from, and it's just not obvious to you. And this tricky technique has now proven this to you. And then you really can't be in doubt about it. And if ever you're in doubt about it, you just have to look again, and then you resolve your doubts. Meditation does offer that kind of clarity with respect to this feeling of self, where you thought something was there, and then you look, and it was clearly not there, and your finding it not to be there makes it no longer feel like it's there, right? It's not like it still feels like it's there, but I know conceptually it's not there. No, it's actually not there.
Yeah, I mean, so I can't tell whether you're saying something that is less radical than I thought the Buddhist claim was. In which case, I definitely can grasp that, and I understand it. And I, as someone who meditates, though I've never been to a retreat, but I've been doing it for a while now, there's definitely points where I start, and it's very hard to describe, where you really do start to feel this kind of, I am a vessel for a flow of experiences and sensations, and it is a relaxing feeling. It's a really sort of it's a kind of release. I guess the issue that I thought I had, and maybe this isn't an issue, or maybe I didn't fully grasp what you're saying, is there still feels like a me that's noticing that's noticing the sensations, that's being aware and mindful of what's going on. And the hard part for me is, if you tell me that me that's being mindful, that's being aware, that's uh, kind of just really tracking what's going on in my body and outside with the sounds moment to moment, like that thing is also an illusion. That's the thing I have difficulty understanding.
When you say me, Tamler, just to be clear about what you're claiming, I believe I understand what you're talking about, and I think it is this conventional starting point of feeling like you are a locus of consciousness inside the head who is now paying attention in this act of meditation to objects like the breath and sounds and sensations in the body, but you are located in your head as a subject that's now meditating or being mindful?
Well, I mean, like, I suppose there are times where, and this is the times that are completely infrequent for me, but also the times where it feels most sort of relaxing, where I'm out of my head and actually in the, like, if I'm feeling the sensation, it feels like it's not mediated by me sort of saying, "Oh, I'm feeling tingling in my feet," or it's just like I'm in my feet, kind of. Those are really fleeting. So maybe that's it. It's like you sort of become the thing and you're not interpreting it. There's no further barrier between you and the experience. Is it something like that?
There is that. So there is this, and this comes straight out of the Buddhist teaching. There's just in the seeing. There's just seeing. There's not a seer and things seen. There's just this moment of seeing, and that can happen by virtue of paying attention so carefully that for a brief moment there is just a moment of seeing or just a moment of hearing, and there's no distance. There's no sense of being a seer on one side with the object of consciousness on the other. It just collapses. And again, this happens for people in the beginning. This happens very briefly. When things really start humming on a meditation retreat and you're kind of in the flow of mindfulness and it becomes effortless, that can characterize much longer stretches of experience where there's just a sense of just phenomenon arising. And so that's also synonymous with not conceptualizing experience. You're in contact with raw sensation rather than thinking about your hand. For instance, a hand is a concept, as a matter of experience, you're just down on the level of tingling and vibration and temperature. And so it can be very kind of laser-like, but there is a very similar but kind of more radical and I would argue more useful insight, which is when you turn that quality of attention on this feeling of being a self itself, you turn it back on the subject, the mind can kind of go into a failure mode there where you look for the thing that's looking and you don't find it, but the not finding is really conclusive, right? It's not paradoxical. It's not a struggle. It's not like, oh, was that it? Did I see something? No, there's a turning which affects. It's similar to what you say of, there suddenly being no distance between consciousness and its object, but you look for this sense of self and it drops away. And then what is left is the totality of everything else that's in consciousness, but it is the experience of consciousness without a center. And that's not the same thing as saying, well, now I'm identical to the universe, although I can understand how people, in the context of a religious interpretation or a New Age interpretation of an experience like this, start talking that way. But it is only the world remains on some level, or only consciousness and all of its objects remains, and there is no I in the middle of it. And the moment there seems to be an I, what is actually happening there, once again, you are thinking without knowing that you're thinking. You're lost in thought. And so this, to come back to your initial question, the sense of being the one who is meditating or the one who's being mindful, the sense of being this subject, yes, it is an uninspected thought on some level in each moment. There's a kind of an undercurrent of still conceptualizing experience and thinking about experience, even when you think you're being mindful of thoughts themselves, that's going uninspected. And that's kind of the structure of it.
It sounds a lot like it's an exercise in shaking off categories and concepts, which intrigues me. Right, so you're almost sort of disabusing yourself of these concepts that we use in everyday life in a pragmatic way of me and you and what. But what I want to know then is what is the relationship between that and not being a dick, right? Like, how does that get you there? And is it one way of asking?
If you're being a dick, you're lost in thought.
Is it this is how Bob Wright sort of described it. Sort of helped him be less of a jerk. I don't see a conceptual link there, so it must be an experiential one that makes you a better person after you've done this.
Well, that actually has a pretty straightforward answer, but there's two levels to it. One is, in the beginning, you can become less of a dick long before you have an insight into selflessness, just by learning to be mindful and being committed to that. So when you look at the things psychologically that cause you to be a dick, right? That cause you to act out, that cause you to let's say, if you feel angry, to helplessly express your anger in relationship, no matter how inappropriate. What that is a fundamental lack of mindfulness. In the worst case, you're not even aware of becoming angry until the words fly out of your mouth, and there's no possibility of being otherwise, right? You see no choice. There's no pause to take because this thing broke over you like a wave and, everything got wet. So basic mindfulness, I mean, even mindfulness that really hasn't revealed much of anything of interest to you psychologically or contemplatively, still gives you some kind of two categories of experience. You can be angry and totally lost in it, or you can be aware of anger as a kind of an energy state of your body or an arising emotion, which you then can either act out or be motivated to act by, or you can observe as just a change in your person. And the observing mode is different and leads to different consequences. It leads you to pause before saying something. But as you get better and better at that, what you begin to notice is that all of these negative emotions have a very short half-life. It's impossible to actually stay angry for any significant amount of time, much less be motivated to derange your life or relationships on its basis, without continually being lost in thought about why you should be angry or why you have every right to be angry. You have to stay lost in thought. I mean, you literally have to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. It's like going back to sleep and getting back into the dream to be angry at one of your dream characters. You have to do that or let it be done to you over and over again in order to stay in this state. And the moment you become sufficiently mindful, and again, this can happen long before any of what I said about selflessness would make sense, you can discover the half-life of negative emotions to be really short, and then you're given some kind of choice where you can say, well, is it worth being angry here? Is there some ethical purpose served by expressing anger? Or is this just me screwing up my life needlessly? And so that's one answer to your question. I'm not holding myself up as someone who has taken this to anything like its ultimate fulfillment. I can speak honestly about the range of my experience, but my experience is not of being stably in this place of seeing through the arising of every thought and every emotion. I mean, nothing like it. The minority of my time is spent clearly experiencing what I'm talking about, and most of my time I'm lost in thought the way everyone is lost in thought. The difference is, and this is a very significant difference in one's mindfulness practice, is that you can spend a lot of time meditating, I mean, literally years on silent retreat, and never clearly realize that you can experience selflessness in every moment of even ordinary awareness. Off retreat, when you were just distracted, you're just watching a movie, nothing particularly meditative's going on, you can cut through to the clarity of selflessness every bit as much there as you can in the most sublime moment in the middle of a 3-month retreat when you've been doing nothing but meditate 18 hours a day and your experience of the world is completely psychedelic in its diaphanous sense of just, everything is just bleeding into everything else and there's just no substantiality to be found anywhere. There's an experience that equalizes those two. You're just grabbing more popcorn at the movie and you feel like Jesus about to deliver the Sermon on the Mount because you feel so good and you love all sentient beings everywhere. Both of those experiences are centerless. Both of those experiences are just as good as the other for recognizing this thing about the illusoriness of the self. And that can take a long time to experience that. And you have to sort of just be lucky, I think.
So what's to stop you from becoming not an emotional dick, but a strategic dick? So are you now what's to stop you from taking over the world with your newfound powers of emotional regulation?
To have an evil motive is synonymous with certain things which now we're talking about no longer feeling or no longer feeling good reason to feel or being disposed to cut through, a kind of selfishness and fear of others and anger and hatred and bias. There's a kind of normative ethical attitude perhaps not across the board. I mean, I think there are serious blind spots in Buddhism just as a philosophy and in Buddhists as people, no matter how much they meditate, that potentially there are what we would consider moral blind spots, or ways in which culture still influence even supposedly enlightened people in ways that we would find to be non-normative. But there's a kind of normative ethics that begins to creep in the moment you put this kind of sense of self in question, and the moment you begin to be aware of the half-life of both negative and positive emotions, and the moment you begin to become aware that the thing you were looking for in experience so avidly, I mean, the gratification of desire, that isn't really a durable basis of well-being. So this is actually something that also came up in your podcast, this discussion of one of the punchlines of Buddhism being that life is suffering. It's not quite the punchline. The punchline is more that life is unsatisfactory. The difference is, and the word here, the Pali word here is dukkha, and it's not that life is just a reliable circumstance of misery. It's easy to get that from Buddhism as well, because there's an emphasis on how bad things can go. But it doesn't deny that there are different levels of happiness, and that some of this happiness can be quite sublime. But because experience is always changing, because there is no stability, to go into this domain of experience seeking stability, seeking to never have any more problems, seeking to scratch an itch and to have it stay scratched, that's a misapprehension. That is bound to be frustrated. So if you're seeking stability in a condition which is by definition not stable, you will suffer. The thing you are clinging to will fall apart in your hands, and you'll get more of the thing you thought you were successfully keeping away. And so that this flux of pleasant and unpleasant experience is going to keep coming, and you, in seeking to only have one and none of the other, you are actually at war with a circumstance that you can't change. And so that changing your attitude toward that is part of the program. But again, mindfulness of its nature changes one's attitude toward that. I mean, because a strong reaction to pleasantness, a grasping reaction, like, oh, I want more of this, or I want to keep this, or a strong reaction to unpleasantness, just aversion, like keep this away, that is what you're canceling when you're being mindful, when you're training in that kind of meditation. And that has ethical implications, because you're no longer trying to control experience in quite the same way.
Yeah, I guess this is the part that I think that can go both ways, right? So there are times where I will want to grasp onto experiences, and so say, oh God, rather than just going on my electronic devices, I'm actually talking to my daughter, and we're joking around, and we're having dinner at the table, or we're watching a movie together. And this is an awesome experience. This is a beautiful experience. And I want to take steps for this kind of experience to happen more often, and not just sink into the normal habitual kinds of things that we sometimes do. And that desire to want to continue experiences that you consider to be both good, pleasurable, but also worthy, seems like a good, or at least I don't see any problem with having that. And yes, it opens yourself up to disappointment when that can't continue. But for while you had it, you made the most of it. And there doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that, but it also seems like sometimes what's being recommended is to just enjoy the experience and not try to, or feel like you want to replicate it, or not feel like you want it to stay any longer than it's going to stay naturally. And I don't know, like it's sometimes you do have to take active steps to preserve something that, or at least feel like you're taking active steps. I know that's, on this view, that's kind of an illusion, but from the subjective phenomenon of it, it's like, okay, so we're going to turn off all devices 3 times a week, and we're going to have dinner at the table 4, whatever it is that you do to get yourself, but you're doing that in order to preserve the experience. You see what I'm saying?
I wouldn't dispute that at all. And actually, even the Buddha, at least in certain of his moods, wouldn't dispute that at all. I mean, I think there's a sutta in the Pali Canon called the Mahamangala Sutta, which is almost like a rank order or a kind of a ladder of happiness, where, he just kind of lists various things that are, and again, I say this, I'm a little self-conscious about how much I seem to be shilling for Buddhism here, because I don't consider myself a Buddhist, and I've said fairly critical things about Buddhism as well, insofar as it can look like a religion. But just to give you the Buddhist view here, they would fully acknowledge that there are many conventional kinds of happiness that are real forms of happiness. They just happen to be impermanent. I mean, they end of their own accord. I mean, people go to sleep at night, or people suddenly get a pain in their knee and things change, or people die, so there's nothing's permanent there. Nothing is truly stable, but they wouldn't dispute that there are deeper or higher levels of pleasure to be experienced in this world, which it certainly makes sense to want, and it makes sense to want some more than others. And you can kind of climb this ladder to the point where, life could get so good under this view that, well, now you're just noticing increments of better where, you're kind of living in a kind of paradise. But still, on the Buddhist view, if you look very closely, right, you'll see that there's an instability here. You can't maintain it perfectly. And the work you're doing to maintain it in certain respects is based on an uninspected error. And there's actually more pleasure awaiting you as a conscious being to change the game, and to kind of equalize your experience, so that you're no longer holding on to things when they change and end, so that you're actually, you can savor moments of experience which now wouldn't strike you as worth savoring. That they're not actually beautiful to you yet, but beauty is largely in the eye of the beholder here, and you could actually be as satisfied with the next moment of experience that you wouldn't single out as being, something you were trying to maximize or create. I mean, so it's only in the kind of its highest mode that it seems to level all distinctions between experience. You talk about somebody who doesn't really care about the difference between pleasure and pain, right? But until you got there as a meditator, well, then there's nothing wrong with sort of climbing this ladder of sublime experiences where you recognize that having quality time with your daughter is better than squandering it bickering or just being lost in your devices. I mean, there's lots of teachings about skillful means and wise uses of attention. And I mean, this is why on the Buddhist view you would ever bother to live an ethical life, because it actually is a kind of raft that you get in to cross a river, and it is really the thing you need to cross the river. But on the Buddhist view, you then, when you cross the river, you don't pick up the raft and carry it on your head. Where we're at, yes, of course, we're going to make distinctions between better and worse experiences. That's really the only rational thing to do, given how good life can be and how needlessly bad it can be if we don't do it.
Well, sign me up. This is like Trump University,
Right.
I'm sold.
Well, in this case, you didn't pay as much as you would have at Trump University.
It's true. It's amazing how cheap, like these kinds of things. There are all sorts of great podcasts and websites, and you can do this for free.
Yes, you can.
That's right.
Well, listen, guys, we've come to the end of many hours. What are we? We're close to 3 hours here. Maybe if I've cut some of this down, we'll be closer to 2.5 hours, but it's not going to be much below that. But it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I kind of felt like I wasn't quite on your podcast, but I was not really aware that it was my podcast some of the time.
That's you knew what you were getting into.
Well, we really appreciate it. We hope to have you back on our podcast soon. We certainly get a lot of requests for that, and Yeah, we didn't talk about Jordan Peterson. That was the other one.
No.
People
Yeah, that
told
was the one other
us
request.
to
we
say.
All right.
We'll
Well, next
save that.
time. Next
Yeah,
time.
next time.
got. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah. Do you want to put out a Twitter address for anyone?
Sure.
At Very Bad Wizards, at Tamler, at Peas, if anybody wants to get in contact with